My name is Danielle and I'm the Deputy Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's International Cyber Policy Centre. My centre at ASPI is a 30-person team that focuses on cyber, emerging and critical technologies and issues related to information, influence and foreign interference. I'm delighted to be chairing this panel we've pulled together for you today as part of the Observer Research Foundation's annual CyFy conference. And this annual event has quickly become one of the leading cyber-focused conferences in the Indo-Pacific and also I'd say globally. And we have quite a special panel here today because as well as being part of CyFy, this panel is also launching and discussing the themes of a report that ORF and ASPI have co-authored and we are launching this week. And that report focuses on critical technologies in the Indo-Pacific and the potential of a deeper India-Australia technology-focused partnership and relationship, the foundations of which we argue in the report are already falling into place. And we're delighted to have Australia's High Commissioner to India, Barry O'Farrell, here to talk about the India-Australia relationship and to touch on some of those foundations that are already in place. And before I introduce the rest of the panel, let me note that the discussion which takes place at ORF events is different to what you get at the bulk of the events in our sector, which are usually sort of hosted out of the US and Europe. And I find that very refreshing. And that's due to a range of reasons, including that ORF injects both an Indo-Pacific perspective and of course a uniquely Indian perspective into global debates. And having India emerge as a leading global voice on technology issues is vital, not least because I think it's clear that India is rapidly emerging as a technology swing state. Policy decisions being made in New Delhi on issues related to 5G, what investments their private and public sector may be making in AI, in quantum, in space technology, on public security technologies, what internet platforms might be banned next, will have a ripple effect for the rest of us. And this is one of the reasons we at ASPI approached ORF earlier this year to see whether they were interested in partnering with us on this project. And we're grateful to have received a grant from the Australian High Commission in India to support this research project. And as well as supporting research, I think targeted grants like this really help promote key track 2 and civil society linkages. And if the pace of our meetings this year and our joint WhatsApp group is anything to go by, it's an incredibly busy, I think, WhatsApp group, these linkages have certainly been cemented throughout this project. Now let's dive into the discussion. We have about an hour. I've sort of absorbed about 5 minutes. And let me briefly introduce our panel. As mentioned earlier, we have High Commissioner Barry O'Farrell on our panel. And I'll also add that before taking on this role, Barry served in the New South Wales Parliament for a decade, including as the state's 43rd Premier between 2011 and 14. And I think that's interesting to note because Barry's interactions with India have crisscrossed his entire career, and I did a bit of a deep dive this week on his career, and it was really interesting. He's led trade missions to India and served as the Deputy Chair of the Australian-India Council. So Barry, thank you very much for joining us today. From ORF, we have Senior Fellow Dr. Rajagopalan, who works on space, cyber and nuclear issues. And we also have Trisha, who focuses on cyber issues and is co-chairing this year's CyFy. And I'm convinced that these two women must be ORF's busiest employees. Both of them are incredibly prolific in their output and play a major role in pushing debates in our sector far beyond India, and I read their stuff regularly here in Canberra. And joining me from ASPI is my colleague Aakriti Bachhawat, and Aakriti focuses on national security issues in the Indo-Pacific and focuses on India, and I think it's a real treasure to have someone who's India-focused and an Australian think tank. It's too rare in my opinion, and we're delighted that you could join us, Aakriti. The way I'm going to run today is I'm going to sort of do what I'm going to call a question and a half, almost like a round of 1.5 questions on the topics we tackle in our report. And Barry, I'm going to start with you because I think there's no one better placed at the moment to take us through where the India-Australia relationship is at In my perch in Canberra, you really can see across departments and agencies that there is this growing focus and this really positive momentum about the state of the relationship. And you can see what I think of as a bit of a real policy hustle developing, particularly from PM&C, which is our Prime Minister's department, and of course from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And I know there are other departments as well, but those two I can see really coming together on this relationship. And we touch a little bit on the upwards trajectory of this relationship in our report. So Barry, can I ask you, why is there this momentum, and how does it look to you in New Delhi with fresh eyes, having arrived in this role earlier this year?
Well, probably fresh virginal eyes, given that I don't have a diplomatic background. But I've come at a good time because within months of arriving, we signed a comprehensive strategic partnership, which I think reflects the depth and the breadth of the relationship between Australia and India. And there was a slew of agreements beneath that, which sees us working across a wide range of areas like defence and critical technologies, which is what mostly today's about, but other areas like water and agriculture, education and skills, public administration and governance, counter-terrorism, and of course the maritime domain, particularly focused on the Indo-Pacific, where both Prime Ministers expressed a desire to shape the post-COVID world in that region. I think the more interesting question, I suppose, is the why. And I had a bit of an insight into it in April when I addressed the National Defence College, and I'd been warned that I would get a few questions that might mention a neighbour of India's a couple of times. And I think in the end, every question mentioned that neighbour. And the theme of those questions was effectively how is it possible that Australia can take independent national interest decisions when your major trading partner, your number one trading partner, is China? And whether I was discussing 5G, whether I was discussing disputes at that stage over trade, there was a real scepticism. And I think reflecting on it afterwards, Australia's decision in relation to 5G, I think, has led to a reset here in India about us, because I think that view that was expressed to me through the questions at the National Defence College had perhaps permeated a number of levels of society here that suggested because we had a major trading partner in China, inevitably we would only make decisions that suited our trading partner. Well, clearly that's never been the case throughout Australia's history in terms of our trade with different countries around the world. And clearly, as we've seen, particularly over the last 12 months, during a crisis where I think all of us have had a chance to take a fresh look at our neighbours, to work out those who are on the same path as we were, and those who we want to work with in the post-COVID world. And I think that's what's brought us together. The fact that we have shared values, a shared outlook on the world, the fact that there is clearly a close relationship between our two Prime Ministers, which was evident even in a virtual interaction as we saw in June, and a determination by us both to shape a post-COVID world in the Indo-Pacific that is about rules and norms, about enabling citizens and countries to determine their futures, and a world in which those rules and norms are not power dominate.
Thank you, Barry. Raji, I'm going to jump to you, and I think a number of the things Barry said are going to be, I suspect you're going to touch on from more of an India perspective. Can you talk us through the landscape that is essentially backgrounding this growing India-Australia relationship? Because there is a lot going on in the background that has, in many ways, is not a part of the relationship, but is impacting the relationship. So there's COVID-19. There's an increasingly assertive Chinese state. There is increasingly tense US-China relations, and a lot of those tensions are around technology. And as well as taking us through what you think this bigger picture landscape looks like, I also wonder if you can touch on whether India and Australia, you believe, have similar views and positions on some of these sort of major geopolitical and strategic issues, and where you might see clear differences of opinion versus an alignment.
Thank you. Thank you, Daniela, so much. And first of all, let me thank the Australian Strategic Policy Institute for partnering with ORF in doing this project. It's been a new experience in some ways because we were entirely virtual in coordinating our respective sections in this report. And entirely writing this report was on virtual world. And second, as someone who has been fighting manals on social media and other platforms, I think we are proud of the fact that this is an all-women panel kind of team that worked on this project. So it's particularly good to see that women do have voices on some of the important critical technology, and we were able to do this. Second, I also want to thank all the authors, Danielle, Aakriti, and Jocelyn from ASPI, and of course, Trisha, who from ORF, my colleague, for contributing to this debate and writing this report in a sense. And of course, all of this would not have been possible without the support from the Australian High Commission. So a very special thanks to the High Commissioner and the Commission itself. So coming to the question, I think that's a really interesting question to look at the kind of strategic dynamics of the Indo-Pacific region that has been shaping the technology conversations and also broader other security issues in a sense. So clearly the idea of the Indo-Pacific has gained significant ground in the last few years. Of course, the changing balance of power in Asia and beyond offers both India and Australia opportunities to take a more proactive role in shaping the emerging dynamics in the Indo-Pacific. But it also calls for both countries to have a clearer understanding of the kind of Indo-Pacific it wants to see and the kind of role the both countries would like to play in this region. And especially since the beginning of the 2000s, Beijing's role, for instance, in the COVID-19 pandemic and the manner in which it has attempted to hijack some of the multilateral institutions such as the World Health Organization or the International Civil Aviation Organization have become salient in conversations among the like-minded partners in the Indo-Pacific. Even as countries in the Indo-Pacific have been battling the coronavirus pandemic, I think China has also been aggressive in its action against all of its neighbors, again, prompting many more Southeast Asia, as well as the larger Indo-Pacific powers to come together to look at as to how we need to shape the Indo-Pacific strategic order. China's, I would say, crude attempts to put pressure on other countries in the region have also been met with stiff resistance. And I think that has given way to a number of trilaterals and minilaterals. Quad is one such manifestation of which the foreign ministers had a face-to-face meeting yesterday in Tokyo. But I think some of the bilateral relations have also seen impressive advancements. And one such case is the India-Australia Strategic Partnership. Both have been bearing the brunt of Chinese aggressive behavior. Since early May, India-China confrontations, including the killing of 20 Indian Army personnel, have changed the dynamics. And I believe that's a game-changer moment in India's approach to at least as far as the China policy is concerned. Similarly, Australia has been under strident Chinese attack almost from the beginning of 2000, using coercive and economic trade practices against targeting Australia. All because Australia took the lead in asking for an independent investigation into the origin of the coronavirus. So in a sense, but I think there is a sense that the real issue is not about targeting Australian beef or Australian wine and barley, but the real game is to create social splits, societal splits that pressure the government to change foreign policy towards China. So both, in a sense, Australia and India are located in this geopolitically turbulent region, a region that is increasingly characterized by mistrust, competition, rivalry, and insecurity. And like I said, this is a demonstration. This is an after effect of the changing balance of power in the region and beyond. But the political problem is also accelerated by some of the technological factors, including its uneven availability, as well as its potential misuse, and which will have a larger impact in the for the strategic stability in the region. But having said that, I think some of the new technologies such as artificial intelligence, robotics, machine learning, hypersonics, drones, and some of the older technologies such as space and missile defense all have an effect on the strategic dynamics. And most major power relations today are shaped by the technological competition, the US-China competition being one example. But the geopolitical impact of new technologies has become a compelling reality, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. But I think here we need to, India and Australia, I think we need to talk about some of these possible issues, and I think this is what we have tried to outline in our report. One is, for instance, how do India and Australia collaborate in terms of the development of technology so that powers that are inimical to free societies do not gain an advantage in developing such technologies. And 5G, telecommunication technologies such as 5G, advanced computing, artificial intelligence are some of these prime examples for this. Second question, I think, relates to the governance of some of these areas, because I think the multilateralism has failed in many ways, especially when it comes to laying out the rules of the road for new and emerging technologies, but also reviewing some of the existing measures for older technologies such as outer space. And if we do not make enough sufficient progress, I think we are not going to be able to develop a cohesive strategy to deal with these use of these technologies in the coming years. I think there are going to be serious problems on that front. But again, does that mean that everything is great all is well between India and Australia, and are we on the same page? I think not. I think there are, even though we have made significant progress over the last few years, we may not be on the same page on every single issue or that we agree upon everything. But I believe our bilateral relationship has matured and become strategic in nature to address those differences and not let those differences become hindrances in furthering our relationship in the future. I think I'll just outline two areas where there could be clarity in the coming years. For instance, I think one of the problem areas that have been highlighted often, at least in the Indian case, is the India-Australia divergent concerns around China, for instance. There are different sets of concerns that drive India and China when it comes to India and Australia when it comes to China, for instance. But I believe this need not become a major hindrance as long as we have shared understanding that we need to promote, we need to champion and make a strong case for the rule of law, rules-based order, respect for human rights, and establish norms of responsible behavior. But I think this also brings me to the second point, which is a skepticism from an Australian side, for instance, the growing skepticism of Modi government's the identity politics. Many have argued that India's recent developments go against the very grain of some of its strategic partnerships that are based on the shared values that I just talked about. So I think there could be issues that we still need to talk it out and iron out, but I think these are not major hindrances that will, I think the concerns about China and actually shaping the strategic order in the Indo-Pacific that is in all of our interests will actually overtake some of these differences, and these differences need not necessarily become hindrances in making further advances in the India-Australia strategic relationship. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Raji. I think no two bilateral partners are at any time always on all the same pages. So I think it's important to talk about both the opportunities and the challenges there. Trisha, I'm going to turn to you now. In our report coming out, you focused on the 5G section, and Barry said earlier about how sort of pivotal that decision was in the sort of development of that relationship. And I couldn't agree more, and especially from a global perspective, I think over the last few years, there's been a real thirst for policy insight into Australia's 5G decision, and that really has come from a lot of different corners. And Australia made that decision back in now, I think, August 2018 on high-risk vendors. So Trisha, I wondered if you could talk about where India is with its 5G decision or decisions, and also if you could elaborate on some of the policy recommendations that you wrote up in relation to India-Australia 5G collaboration going forward.
So for a significant amount of time, India's position on foreign vendors in 5G could be best described as fence sitting, in that while there were concerns being raised within the country on allowing a vendor from a country we do not share friendly relations with into our core networks, for the most part, the government had gone ahead with allowing Chinese vendors to participate in trials. That changed quite dramatically this year. And I think two factors played a role. One, of course, is the declining perception of China because of their initial mismanagement of the pandemic, which has impacted all of us massively. And then the second, more immediate factor was the Galwan incident, the clashes between Indian and Chinese border forces, which really took the public perception of China down to its current low. And that resulted in, first, the Ministry of Electronics and IT barring the state-owned telcos from using Chinese equipment in their 5G networks. And they both already signed 5G contracts with ZTE and Huawei, so a fairly costly decision for them, but they went ahead with it. And then recently, also triggered in part, perhaps due to the US decision on 5G clean networks, the private telcos in India have also canceled their contracts with foreign vendors. Airtel and Vodafone have decided to go with Ericsson and Nokia instead. And so we've seen strengthening of the China hawk side of the Indian government and a relative weakening of the more optimistic portion of the government, which believes in continued cooperation, economic cooperation with China. We've also, for instance, seen a series of app bans, over 200 now, Chinese apps that have been banned from India. So significant moves in that area. Then in terms of areas of cooperation that are highlighted as part of the report, the first centers around, there's this growing debate globally on a coalition of democracies or like-minded countries who can come together, perhaps providing alternate sources of 5G equipment, helping shape standards and so on, the D10 Club of Democracies, which seems to be on pause right now, but hopefully there'll be some progress on that. So in that, there is room for India and Australia to lead some sort of Indo-Pacific collaboration in this area. India, for instance, does have, or there's a vendor here that is working on homegrown 5G solutions, Geo, so that we do have a regional alternative to the relatively cheap 5G equipment provided by Chinese vendors. That's one area. The second area of rising concern, which might not immediately seem intuitive, is there's this growing problem of misinformation surrounding 5G. There was already rumors of 5G causing a range of diseases, but I think the COVID-19 pandemic definitely stoked those fears. And having been on several 5G webinars, I have had many questions addressed to me on whether we should be going ahead with a 5G rollout, given that it causes COVID-19. And that is important because for the spread of any critical technology, in this case 5G, consumer trust and user trust is essential. And if we don't have that, the rollout is going to fall flat before we even start. Yeah.
I remember actually when you first put that in the report, you're right, it's not an area that first comes to mind, but it actually dovetails really well with a number of things happening in Australia. So the Australian government through DFAT has set up a sort of disinformation team. I think we're becoming more aware about both disinformation and misinformation being pushed by state and then non-state actors. So there's a sort of interesting rise of online conspiracy groups happening. So I thought that was a really good recommendation. Aakriti, let's head over to you now. You've been watching the Australia-India relationship for a long time. I want to say decades, but you're too young for that. So I'll say 1 decade. You did a fantastic job in the report at analysing the evolution and expansion of the relationship. And I think what is clear when it comes to critical and emerging tech and I think this is becoming more and more of an issue this year, is that there is no standout multilateral agency which pulls together the right mix of players, or that is particularly influential in this space. So the debates and the policy conversations that are occurring are actually really occurring in spaces like CyFy, and sort of other different 1.5 track dialogues going on, some of which are closed or some of which are not. In my mind, they're not really happening at the UN, for example. But of course, you absolutely necessarily want a seat at those tables in the multilateral institutions, but we also know that when it comes to tech, they're a little slow moving and slow acting. And the cyber and tech policy space to me stands out because it isn't waiting around for multilateral institutions to make decisions. It's a rapidly moving space where major decisions are made daily, often not by governments, but by the CEOs of global tech and internet companies, especially coming out of the US, China, or Europe. So, Aakriti, I have a 2-part question for you. 2 quite different topics, but I have full faith that you're going to sew them together for us in some way. One is something Raju mentioned before, which is how important is the sort of mini-lateral engagement in the India-Australia relationship that you can see continuing to emerge? And for the second, could you briefly touch on why you think there is an opportunity for India and Australia to cooperate more closely on critical minerals and rare earths, which was one of the case studies in our report?
Sure. Thanks, Danielle. I think it's a really opportune time to be talking about minilateral cooperation in the context of the India-Australia relationship. As we just saw, the ministers of the quadrilateral, the 4 ministers of the quadrilateral security dialogue met up in Tokyo yesterday, and it's been making headlines. My Twitter feed is flooded with all the analysis, the fresh and first up analysis from various people. But and I just had a brief skim through of the 4 statements released by the respective ministers. What really strikes me when I think of the Quad and how far it has come since it was revived in 2017 is the fact that early on, the Australia-India relationship used to be seen as the weakest leg of the Quad because of, some sort of residual mistrust from 2007. But what we should also recognize is the fact that it has come so far because of the burgeoning Australia-India relationship. So we should credit the, how much work has been done bilaterally between these 2 countries, and how that has partly been responsible for, the strengthening of the Quad. And Australia and India have been really active in sort of building partnerships with middle powers, across the Indo-Pacific, be it Japan, be it Indonesia. So, and this just, ultimately, this just speaks to and reinforces the habits of cooperation and the institutional trust that is, between Australia and India, and that's being just reinforced in minilateral settings as well. This year, the Quad was active, has been active in conversations around vaccines in plus formulations, Quad plus formulations involving countries like South Korea, Vietnam, and New Zealand. So it has a really good knack. This is like the core. The Quad is like a really good core of countries which has a good knack of attracting like-minded partners in conversations that are of mutual interest. Again, in the context of COVID-19, yesterday the ministers talked about the health and economic issues that need to be addressed going forward. There was the discussion around counterterrorism, maritime security. Those have been traditional issues that have always been part of Quad discussions. But interestingly, now there is some conversation around disinformation, as Trisha was talking about. There was the Australian statement recognized that these countries could work together on disinformation and cooperate on countering disinformation. So ultimately, I feel that minilateral cooperation and especially the Quad is a really good mechanism for working together on things that affect all 4 nations, and we're increasingly seeing that in the context of an assertive and a revisionist China, those issues are multiplying. So it's in it's working to our interest to sort of have these conversations in as transparent a manner as possible. So with Indonesia, like Australia, the Australia, India, Indonesia trilateral, I think is also an important trilateral mechanism that has been working on maritime security issues in the Eastern Indian Ocean. Then there is the Japan, India, Australia trilateral that again has been a really good sort of a setting that that says that we don't always need the United States. We're the resident powers in the region, and we don't always need the United States to lead us. Also, I think just now this provides me a good segue into talking about the resilient supply chain initiative led by the Japan, and this was recently sort of talked about as sort of a really good initiative to further cooperation between like-minded partners to diversify their assembly and procurement lines and reduce the risks of dependency on a single country. I think also the resilient supply chain initiative has the potential to attract other countries, other like-minded partners, and is sort of going for, I think COVID-19 has made the conversation around having resilient supply chains topmost a really important priority for nations in the region. Okay, this provides me a good segue to go into the question on critical minerals and rare earths. I think it's imperative for Australia and India to cooperate on critical minerals, as India needs a steady supply of rare earths for its Make in India initiative. Australia is a leading producer of rare earths and is in a great position to supply them. I think, and it's also advantageous for Australia to, as it looks for newer and friendlier markets for its minerals. As Australia looks to shore up its manufacturing sector, there are particular synergies to be explored in the fields of downstream processing and advanced manufacturing to bolster India's Make in India initiative. India is a net importer of processed rare earths, despite holding 1/5 of the world's reserves, because those minerals are largely untapped by India's state-owned mining companies. New Delhi needs to invest and build, in expertise across a range of and all stages of mining, including geoscience, exploration, development, production, and reclamation. And Australia is ideally positioned to sort of share its expertise in mining with India, and there's great potential for partnerships through research linkages and investments. Also, I think the producers of critical minerals, there is this growing recognition that no country can be sufficient in critical minerals and rare earths on its own, and it's important to partner up with countries. And in this case particularly, I think the fact that Australia and India trust each other today is really important. Because these minerals will form the backbone of industries and all the backbone of the manufacturing industries in both countries. So I think it's just natural for Australia and India to cooperate on critical minerals and rare earths, and there are great synergies to be explored there. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Aakriti. I gave you two quite different topiks to mesh together there, and you did a great job.
I think I rambled quite a bit, but I'll go.
No. It's good for these events to come out and bounce around in different topics. Barry, I'm going to come back to you now. The report we're releasing talks a lot about the potential of what we see as this budding India-Australia technology relationship, and we zeroed in on different critical tech opportunities. So across 5G, space technologies, AI, quantum, and critical minerals, as Aakriti's just talked about. Can I ask you, from your viewpoint, where do you think there are sort of gaps and opportunities and challenges as well for Australia across both the government and business sectors in these areas?
Thanks, Danielle. Before I do it, can I just reflect on a couple of comments that have been made? Firstly,
that'd be great.
Australia and India are never going to be on the same page 100% of the time, any more than I would honestly say my wife and I are, although every time she asks, I certainly confirm we are. But what's important is that we share values, we share an outlook, and each time we're able to share a learning or share a problem, we establish some trust that I think takes us to the next point, which means the next conversation is more frank, more open, and we can burrow down, as you do as you establish a personal relationship or a business relationship. There will be issues that both of us, decisions both of us take at times. We are vibrant democracies. We respect our national interests, and sometimes we may disagree about those decisions, but what we don't discount is the fact that we are democracies, and those decisions are made after people elect governments, elect parliaments, and parliaments for the term are able to make those decisions. So I don't think those issues are going to get in the way of this relationship. Secondly, as Aakriti said, the issue of critical minerals and, importantly, critical supply chains has perhaps been the latter's been the biggest learning of this COVID crisis. And what's important is that the next time the world has another shudder, that particularly in the critical areas that govern those areas that determine whether people are going to be able to act freely or not, that the supply chains are protected, are secure, and are in place. And I think that's what the Quad was starting to talk about, starting to reflect on in their meeting. So I think that's the setting I just wanted to put was that we're never going to agree 100%, but we're heading in the right direction. And like any relationship, there'll be the odd bump, but I don't think it'll be a serious bump. And secondly, we are, along with other countries, in an inclusive way, focusing on that supply chain issue that is the biggest learning. We're focusing on it in our part of the world, and we're doing that because that's our first priority. In terms of the question you ask about challenges and opportunities and gaps, it is, first I should commend the report that both the ORF and ASPI have produced. I've seen a draft of the recommendations. I haven't read the report. I think it touches all the right areas, and it's the sort of civil society interaction we need to see more of, and hopefully we will see it. And I think the challenges are pretty obvious. The challenges are largely around the ecosystem in which we're both going to be operating in this area, and that's why I think there's a degree of alignment between both countries about wanting to have a say in the way in which that ecosystem is made fit for purpose for the future in this area where critical technologies are emerging that, as I say, are going to shape the future of citizens and economies, and where we need to ensure that the rules and the ecosystem that operates is a free and open one, and not one that enables authoritarian, criminal, or other elements to manipulate them. So I think that's an area, and it's an area that I suspect at some stage technological outreach will be a priority for the Quad. So I think that in a sense is a positive. I think there are other areas where there are opportunities which it needs to go beyond the government to government relationship. I know at the present time there's enormous interest in India across a variety of ministries about the way in which we've made decisions here in some of these areas, and there's interactions at a secretary level. Certainly the Foreign Secretary here has been active with his counterpart in Australia and has been said across the Quad and wider countries. But we've also seen senior bureaucratic level discussions going on, some of which are being institutionalised through joint working groups in areas we've been discussing today and in other areas as well. So there's the government to government. I think, as has been said, India is a technologically advanced country, and no bigger sector has progressed, including through this pandemic, than its technology sector. We need to improve the business-to-business links between our two countries, because I think we both have skills, we both have things we can bring to the table, and ultimately the strength of this relationship is going to be in the private sector, the business sector. It can't just be the government sector alone. And the gap, if you like, which I'm happy to admit to, I think is we need to do more in the research and institutes areas. We need to strengthen those ties, and we do have some track record in this area. The Australia-India Strategic Research Fund has been around for 16 years. A lot of money's been put into it. There's been a special COVID round this year, and it's about bringing researchers on both sides of the ocean together to work on common projects. I think in this area, in emerging technologies like AI, computing, quantum computing, and big data, which will shape the future, we need to see more research between our people in both countries. And I just want to highlight the forthcoming cyber and cyber-enabled technologies grants program, which is seeking proposals for research or capacity building collaborations between Australian and Indian institutions focused on things like how emerging technologies like AI and quantum computing and big data will shape that future. The development of critical technology frameworks, best practice and standards, and improving the cyber security resilience of the region in line with what our foreign minister has been talking about. And through this grants program, we're hoping to deepen institutional linkages between Australia and Indian researchers, business and government on cyber and critical technology issues. And I think that's one of the gaps we do need to fill, because this needs to be a multi-layered relationship, which reflects almost the complexity of the technologies that we're talking about. But I'm confident that we've started well, that the interest on both sides of the Indian Ocean is deep, that contacts are becoming regular. As I say, some of them are being put into some formal shape, and I'm optimistic for the future. And I agree with Aakriti that our critical minerals, particularly those that they're not all in Western Australia, but particularly those already developed in Western Australia, the critical minerals, the rare earths, can not only assist strengthen this relationship, but, as has been said, help India achieve its Make in India objectives as well. If India wants to have that world-class electric vehicle industry, it needs lithium and nickel and other rare earths, and they can certainly come from Australia. If India wants to continue in the cyber and critical technology sector, we can supply the elements to enable it to do so. And we're certainly at this stage got a better relationship with India than perhaps the other large provider of those elements.
Thank you, Barry. I think that the grant process you mentioned comes at such an important time. We're doing a quantum research project at ASPI authored by some Australian quantum academics, and I was asking them about opportunities for closer Australia-India collaboration on quantum, and they said, the opportunities are absolutely there, because the two countries bring different strengths, particularly around quantum computing, but it will be through grant processes like what you mentioned, which will actually help kickstart important partnerships. So thank you so much for raising that. I think we have time for one more question, and Raji, I feel like we couldn't finish this panel appropriately unless we spoke about space, which is a passion of yours. And actually, I think the most recommendations in the report ended up being about space. You wrote that section and led on this piece of the project. And space is really interesting. It's becoming a really hot topic in Canberra at the moment. I feel like 2 years ago, I rarely heard about space. Now I can't go to a meeting without someone talking about space technology opportunities and Australia's sort of small, but I think very passionate push into space. From the Australian perspective, there isn't huge resourcing being put there yet, but I think we'll see that change in coming years. And what we're lacking in resourcing, I think, as I said, there's a lot of passion behind it. Can I ask you, Raji, and Barry, please also come in on this later if you have anything to say on space. Raji, why should India and Australia be working more closely together on space? And could you sort of touch base on where you see the key opportunities, and then make sure if you mention any acronyms, spell them out for those of us who are not space.
Absolutely. No, I think, thank you, Danielle. I think it's important to look at space for a number of different reasons, because I think we are all so reliant, dependent on space for a number of different operations, functions, whether it is to do with our trade and economics, weather, meteorological support, navigation. If you want to go to the nearest market, you want to quickly check out on your GPS where you and get around, and of course communications, and of course the latest has been, of course, the military set of requirements on space assets, and I think these have become enormous in that sense, and therefore I believe that can also be an ideal sort of an area for collaboration between India and Australia. Both, of course, have very different stages of their space program. India has been in the space business for about 5 decades now. Australia, in that sense, is just beginning. But I believe there are still avenues for collaboration. And I'll just touch back straight on the High Commissioner's point about for instance, everything should not be led by the government to government. And I think that's a very important point, because India and Australia have a growing and energetic private sector, and some of them have very niche capabilities and technologies. And I believe one of the areas is also, for instance, the more the states are reliant on space, there is also the growth of counter space capabilities to deny any advantages that may come about through the use of counter space capabilities, whether it is anti-satellite capabilities or use of cyber and electronic measures in space to deny the adversary those advantages from the use of space. And here, I think both the Indian and Australian private sector can collaborate in bringing about creating new areas, new counter space technology, counter to counter space technology. I think that's an ideal area to collaborate, because there are going to be satellite disruptions, whether it's intentional or not. These will have economic and societal implications given the kind of dependence that we have. So I think private sector engagement, and I don't think, again, we need to be looking at the big players in this one, but I think there are a whole range of small and medium-sized enterprises in this regard, especially in India, I'm absolutely aware of. But I think we can start those kind of conversations, bringing together these, and I think these can be done through several, again, something that we have highlighted in our report, through conversations at track 1, track 1.5, and track 2 levels, and to create these conversations, linkages between the private sector. Second, in terms of some of the areas that I'm kind of interested, one is, of course, the remote sensing satellites, because I think given that Indo-Pacific region is so prone to natural disasters, I think if the two countries have to take a lead in kind of reaching out with their help, especially in the HADR operations, humanitarian assistance and disaster response relief operations, I think this is one of the areas where we can kind of collate and bring together the remote sensing data and identify the areas there where we need to work together. And I think this has been done in the past. For instance, in 2005 tsunami, how India and the US and other navies were able to come together. That's may not have seen as much of remote sensing data being used, but I think the habit of collaboration came together in a very critical area like the tsunami of 2005. So I think that is one set of issues. A second set of issues is the ISR data. There are some issues. ISR is the intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance data that are being put together. I believe there might be still issues to work out, because of course Australia is part of the Five Eyes intelligence cooperation. So there might be limits of that particular cooperation. But I think it is important for us, given that India and Australia are increasingly talking about the maritime security and the larger security contours that affect us both individually. I think there is need for exploring this particular aspect because, for instance, if I have to give you an example, India and the US, for instance, have signed on to several different agreements that would actually make a case for stronger intelligence collaboration, stronger information sharing between the two sides, including ISR. In fact, the two sides are going to be signing the BECA, that is the essentially geospatial information being shared between the two sides. That's going to be signed at the India-US 2+2 dialogue that is going to happen end of the month. So I think there are ways to explore this particular. They are sensitive and tricky, but I think we need to explore, given the kind of distances that we have traveled together in expanding India-Australia relationship. In this regard, again, I would say, I think given the importance of maritime security in the Indo-Pacific context to both of us, I think maritime domain awareness, MDA, using space assets is something, again, that is very, very relevant. And also SSA, another acronym, space situational awareness, especially as both countries seek to invest and expand their investment into space. I think these are some of the potential areas for collaboration. But I do hope that you will look into the report for more detailed information as to how these can be done. But I think this space does offer an ideal area for collaboration between the two sides. But this is something that can be expanded to other capable and like-minded partners, whether it is Japan, for instance, South Korea, and of course Singapore and Vietnam, and the others who are also getting linked in by a common thread of how we need to have a Indo-Pacific sort of a space grouping in a sense. So I think this is gaining a lot more traction, something that can be developed further in the coming years.
Thank you, Raji. Apparently we have gone 5 minutes over, which is my fault, but I do want to say there was some very impressive space acronym explanations going on. I could see you sort of catching yourself and then quickly spelling it out. So thank you so much for that. I will wind things up, and I feel like we could go on and on and on, but we have hit our limit today. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Please visit aspi.org.au to find the report, and we are going to continue to work on this project. We'll be writing some newspaper articles and doing some podcasts, and please tune into the rest of CyFy this week, and you can access their events at www.orfonline.org and of course through their social media accounts. Barry, Raji, Aakriti, Trisha, thank you very much for joining us on this panel, and hopefully we can all sort of come together soon.
Thank you.